It's 4 o'clock in Los Angeles, and you know what that means. It's time for another exciting episode of Taxi TV Live. Almost forgot the clapper. Good afternoon, or good evening. Maybe for some of you in Europe, it's like good middle of the night, or good morning. Okay, so... was 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, whatever, I did a show on mixing, and a lot of people commented after that, why don't you do one on recording? And the reason I've always hesitated to do that is that I am a dinosaur. It has been a very, very, very long time since I actually sat behind a console in a studio and made a record. Back when I did it, people still used 24-track tape and really big $1 million consoles, and Pro Tools didn't exist yet. But then every now and then I get carried away and can't help myself. I've been known to serve up a practical recording tip, and people seem to appreciate it. I guess some of the stuff still makes sense even in today's world because it's microphones and wires and mic placement kind of stuff. And it doesn't matter if you're recording to tape or if you're using Pro Tools. So the other day I was hanging out in a room with some staff members, and we got on the subject of recording pianos, and I mentioned a really practical, what I thought was a practical tip, and a couple days later Kevin Houlihan, who's our VP of Film and TV, stopped me in the hallway and he said, man, you know, that was such a great tip that you gave us. It never crossed my mind to do that. And I thought, I wonder how many other people's minds that didn't cross. So I thought that I would do a show on recording, but I hope that all of you are here because I don't want to have to repeat this again later. Look, there are no real rules in recording. Everybody's got an opinion, everybody's got a technique, everybody's got their own preferences. So anything I say today, you know, it's the way I would do it. And I'm trying to adjust what I'm saying, assuming that most of you don't have an SSL and... you know, don't have $1 million worth of stuff in your room. I'm assuming that some of you guys may have nothing more than GarageBand and a single microphone. So I'm going to give you tips that are kind of slanted at, you know, not the lower end, but stuff that you can use at home. So I hope you find it useful. I also want to mention that Robin was again slated to be on the show today, but she was fighting her cold for like, I don't know, 2.5, 3 weeks. And then she finally started feeling better, but she had already had a trip planned to go see her sister this week. So I let her off the hook. So she will be back. And next week, don't miss next week's show. We are going to have Judy Stakey with us, who for 20 years was like Senior VP of Warner Chappell Music Publishing. She's been on once before. Judy is largely responsible for discovering, nurturing Sheryl Crow, getting her signed, and helping her have a fabulous career. Judy is one of the greats, and just an amazing publisher, and she teaches classes. She does little songwriting workshops, and I guess it was probably 6 months ago, 9 months ago, we actually signed our daughter Hannah up for one of her workshops and paid for it. I want you to know, I don't get all kinds of stuff for free because I am taxi boss. I was actually willing to pay for it, and I've got to say Hannah loved it, and she came out the other end of that workshop a much better writer. So for those of you who live locally, Judy's got another one of her workshops coming up, I believe, in mid-April. We'll have her on the show next week and ask her about the workshop then. Let's see, what do I have in my notes? Oh, I want to give you some background on where I got my experience. I want to make this short, but it's almost impossible to. When I was 9 years old, I saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I said to my parents, when I grow up, that's what I want to do. And they said, be a rock star? And I said, no, I want to make records. And they thought that was an odd statement for a 9-year-old. But 10 years later, I was in Miami, going to the University of Miami. I was a business major, had not even started my music minor because I didn't know that I wanted one yet. And happened to be in a music store, kind of like modern day Guitar Center. Overheard a delivery guy going to a place called Criteria Studios, and I asked if I could take a ride. He, against his better judgment, let me go. I happened to be sitting in the lobby and overheard the owner of the studio say, "We need a new kid to clean this place up." I jumped up and down till they kicked me out. Called him 25 times that week until Friday afternoon. He finally interviewed me for the job. It was an internship. I got it, and I worked my butt off and kind of moved up the ladder from being an intern to an assistant engineer, and then eventually I became an engineer and eventually started producing. But the reason I bring that up is, back in my day, the age when dinosaurs still walked the earth, the criteria, well, for instance, the day I started, the Eagles were there recording the One of These Nights record. The whole album. Clapton was there doing 461 Ocean Boulevard, which had I Shot the Sheriff on it. The Bee Gees were doing the album that had Jive Talkin' on it, and Stephen Stills was doing a solo record, all under the same roof in one place at the same time. So, yes, I cleaned up after those guys, and I did food runs and whatever else was asked of me, but I also was allowed to stand in the back of control rooms every now and then as I moved up the ladder, I was in control rooms on official capacities and then more officially. But the cool thing was, and I do have a point in telling you this, the cool thing was that we shared information. If somebody on the staff got a great kick drum sound, everybody else would get curious and say, "How did you do that?" and lean over and look at the EQ, look at the mic placement, look at if there was a noise gate involved or a limiter or a compressor involved. We would ask questions, we would share information, and we all grew together and we all built on each other's techniques, and nobody was too precious about it. So today, because most people are isolated in home studios, the sharing of information takes place mostly on the internet. And it's not the same as hearing it in a room and leaning over and looking at the console. Or being in the room when a microphone gets moved around or EQ gets changed or whatever. I think as much information as gets shared on the internet, a lot of it is erroneous, and a lot of people put themselves out there as really top-notch, highly experienced engineers when they may not be. So you never know if the information you're getting is good or bad. I mean, I guess it's better to take it all in and figure it out for yourself. But man, oh man, I grew up working with guys like Tom Dowd and Arif Mardin, that's Mardin, Carl Richardson, Albie Galutin, Don Gaiman, Bill Simzik. I mean, those were the people I went to work with every day. So I got to learn a bunch of great stuff from an amazing group of people. Tom Dowd being probably the best of the bunch. And I am privileged to have spent any time at all with him. And I was very fortunate in that I got to spend ultimately thousands of hours in the control room with him and learned a lot. And believe me, I was not alone. I think all of us who worked at Criteria in the 70s learned at his feet. And what he passed down to all of us hopefully has been passed down to other people. And that's why I'm doing the show today, because I know stuff. And I'm going to share some stuff with you. Let's see. What else? Oh, I want to tell you a great story about that, my auspicious beginnings at Criteria. Some of you who are on the show and know me fairly well have probably heard this before. So sorry for repeating it, but not everybody's heard it. So my first day on the job at Criteria, it was almost like an initiation thing. They give you a bottle of lemon oil and a couple of Q-tips. And I remember it was a guy named Steve Klein, who I'm still friends with, and he lives here in Southern California now. Anyway, he walked me into Studio A, where they recorded Eat a Peach by the Allman Brothers, among many, 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 many other great records in that room. And back in the olden days, we didn't have consoles with channel strips on it. It was just a big piece, probably about 4.5, 5 feet wide, of black anodized aluminum that had been drilled out and cut out, and the knobs and buttons went through there. And if somebody needed to change a capacitor, they would tilt the whole thing up like the hood of a car, put a couple of 2x4s in there, and then the tech guys would crawl in on their back wearing protective glasses with a soldering iron and solder upside down as the solder was hitting them in the face or the eyes, hopefully bouncing off the protective glasses. So I got sent in there with the bottle of lemon oil and the Q-tips, and my job was to take the lemon oil and the Q-tip and put the tiniest little drop on a Q-tip and sit there and do and clean this entire console square inch by square inch using the lemon oil and the Q-tips. Whoops, hang on a second. Hi, Angel. I'm in the middle. I was going to say, I'm in the middle of doing Taxi TV. Anyway, so I was cleaning away, and Steve Klein put on a 16-track, I believe it was 16, not 24-track, 2-inch safety of the song Layla, which had been recorded there, I don't know, probably 2 years before I started working at Criteria. And he set the autolocator on repeat, and he said, so here's the deal. Take one hand, and I'm a lefty, so take your left hand and do the lemon oil, and take your right hand, and every time the tape goes back to the top, bring up a fader. And he said, you really can't break anything, and just sit there and bring faders up, and it'll help you understand multi-track. So yes, yours truly at the ripe old age of 19 years old got to do my own remix of Layla, and I knew nothing, absolutely nothing. Didn't know what a pan pot did, didn't know what an equalizer did, certainly didn't know what any outboard did, but I did bring up the faders one by one and tried to balance a mix, and somewhere in my office I've got a cassette laying around that has my mix of Layla on it. So that was pretty cool. Anyway, let's see. What else can I tell you? Isolation, talked about that. Talked about sharing information. Oh, so after a couple of years at Criteria, I heard about a studio in Fort Lauderdale that was owned by a guy about my age whose wealthy grandfather had built him the studio. And the guy really didn't know that much about recording, and he didn't know much about running a business. And I went there as an independent to produce a record, can't remember who it was with, and ended up never leaving. And he basically bowed out, so I had myself a 24-track world-class studio that I didn't have to pay to build. And the point in telling you that is I got to really, really hone my chops because I was the engineer every day, all day, 365 days a year at that studio. It was called Triad Recording, Triiad Recording. He had to insert a second I because he got sued over the name, I think. So it was great. On days where we didn't have sessions, my assistant engineer and I would go in and spend an 8 or 10 or 12-hour day trying different microphones on different instruments, or remixing something that I'd already worked on that I wasn't happy with, or trying out a new piece of outboard gear. Whatever the circumstance, that place was my playground for the next 5 or 6 years, and I want to publicly apologize to all the clients who I used as guinea pigs over those years. It was just amazing having that kind of room at my disposal all day, every day. And I learned a lot by trial and error, which is what you're going to have to do. I don't know that anything I'm going to tell you today is going to make you magically wonderful in 5 minutes. It was at that studio that I worked extensively with Neil Young. And most of it came out on the record Comes a Time. I think stuff from those sessions ended up on 2 or 3 other albums over time. But for the most part, it was Neil and myself and my assistant Paul, and just the three of us working every day. And a lot of it was just Neil coming up with songs, and he'd walk around with his acoustic guitar, a lot of times literally walking around with Paul holding up an 87 on a mic stand, following him around. And when we could get him to sit down, we'd actually really record something. But I think it was on the first day of that session, I sat there, trying to get this amazing acoustic guitar sound, and was setting the compressor and diddling around with the EQ, and finally Neil looked up at me with a little bit of disgust on his face, and he said, enough already. Stop with the equalizer, stop with the compressors. As a matter of fact, for the rest of this record, I don't want you to touch any EQ or any compressors. learn how to ride gain, and remember, it's all about capturing the vibe and the performance. It's not about making it sound great. You can always do that stuff later. So thank you, Neil, for teaching me really, probably the most important thing I ever learned in my career, sitting behind a console. So, you know what? A lot of great sounds start with great players. You can take a really cheap, bad-sounding, crummy drum set and put a great drummer behind it, and that drum set is going to sound really, really good. You could take the world's most expensive drum set with the world's best microphones and the best preamps, the best console, the best everything, and it might sound like crapola if the person playing the drums doesn't have a great touch. It's feel, it's dynamics. That's where it starts. That's one of the things Tommy Dowd taught me, was it's all about the source. What's coming out of the source? And, garbage in, garbage out. Trying to look at the chat room to see if anybody's got any questions yet, but I'm kind of on a roll, so I'll get to the questions later. So that, for me, might be rule number one of recording, is consider the source. Consider the instrument. Consider the part that the instrument and the musician are doing. Let's talk about piano. Let's start with piano. Let's assume that it's a grand piano. I used a Yamaha 7-foot 4-inch that sounded amazing most of the time. At Criteria, sometimes I got to use the piano that was used on Layla and a bunch of other big records there. If I remember correctly, it was a Baldwin, and it wasn't anything special, but it did sound really good. But I see people do crazy, crazy stuff with grand pianos, and I chuckle to myself, because sometimes I think that they overthink it, they overdo it. Look, when you're stereo miking a piano, which more often than not is what people do, I think it's quite hysterical that I'll see people do an MS pattern or an XY pattern, all this stuff with the microphone set like this or set like that, and they do all this complicated stuff, and they're, switching it in phase and out of phase, and they'll do close mics, and then they'll do far mics, and they'll take the lid off the piano, and they do all this wacky stuff, but they never actually consider where the pianist's hands actually are. And I would say more often than not, they spend the majority of their time in the middle octave, and most of the playing happens here. So guess what? Most of the strings that are being hit with the hammers are right there. So why then do people put one microphone way down on the bass octave, on the lowest end of the piano, and then another microphone way up on the high end, trying to get a nice stereo spread? I've seen people do this, where the mics are set up like that, and trying to get this really wide spread. But ironically, everything that's being played is pretty much right underneath the microphones, and for those strings, the mics are at a 45-degree angle or a 30-degree angle, whatever wacky angle they end up at. So really what you're getting is an off-axis, which generally means less frequency response from those microphones for the strings that are the most important. So there you go. Rule number one is which part of the piano is being used, and that's where I would put my mics. Second thing you have to consider is the dynamic of the part that's being played. Now, you could be doing a concerto on a piano, some classical piece that's very light and then has bigger dynamics and goes all over the place. The whole keyboard is being played. Yeah, for that, you know what? You might want to move the piano to a very special part of the room that sounds great. Open the lid all the way up. I've seen people, I used to do it too, take the lid off and use a stereo pair that's in an XY pattern or an MS pattern, which is mid-side. And actually that comes up on 3 faders, and you bring the 3rd fader up to kind of go in and out of phase. But I'm not going to get that complicated today. Anyway, yes, if I were doing that sort of thing, I would actually go out there and have the guy playing the part play it for me and stick my face down in front of the piano and move my head around and go, ooh, sounds good right there. Well, if it sounds good right there, then stop and take a moment and listen to what's coming into your left ear, what's coming into your right ear, and decide where your microphones are going to go based on that. How much of a spread do I want or do I need? What about if the guy is playing very delicately and then really hammers it? You may want to set the mics further back so that you don't crap out the capsules with too much level, although with modern microphones that's fairly hard to do. You may want to consider throwing a compressor or a limiter, same thing depending on how you set it up on those mics, but then you've got to do that in stereo so that you don't get weird phase relationships. Anyway, sorry, I keep looking over at I should just hide the chat room so I don't get distracted. So there you go. Listen to what's going on, check out the dynamics, see which strings are being affected, and set it up accordingly. If you're doing an overdub, let's say for a rock or a pop thing, chances are the majority of the part is going to be fairly blocky chords, and it's going to be in the middle octave with occasional little walks up or down. So again, stick it over where the hands are, and I would say typically probably with the microphones somewhere on the order of 6 to 10 inches off of the strings. The closer you get, the more of the sound of the hammer you're going to get, the brighter it's going to be, a little more strident it's going to be. If you're doing a classical piece and you want a more natural sound that doesn't have that strident kind of edgy quality to it, then open the lid and move the mics back and let them stare into the piano's cavity, and then maybe get into the fancy mic techniques. It's extremely rare that you have to do that. All right, I'm going to take a couple of piano questions while we're on it. So if you've got them, now's a good time. Well, we're going by kind of quickly. Okay, how do you get rid of the pedal sound? Not the actual pedal, but the internal shift that's created by the pedal. You know what? In the context of a pop or a rock thing, I don't think you're going to hear that. If you're doing a classical piece and you are going to hear it, it's just part of the instrument. I don't know what to tell you. By the way, I do know guys, and I've tried it and never had it work out that well for me, who will throw a stereo pair underneath the piano to get the resonance of the wood. I just don't know. I don't think that if we all went blindfolded into a control room and you were to listen to a piano that was mic'd in a practical manner, above the strings, and then somebody added in the stuff underneath, I don't think you'd like what you heard from the underneath mics. I think that generally speaking, you're asking for phase relationship problems, and if nothing else, what you're getting underneath sounds kind of tubby and muddy anyway, and you certainly won't have a lack of like lower mid-range stuff miking from the top, so don't worry about it. By the way, Elton John always had a magnificent piano sound, and his stuff was almost always close mic'd, and that's why I think it sounded so good. But again, if you're doing classical, try the more expensive microphones, try taking the lid off, try opening the lid wide and go back further. But for most rock or pop stuff, keep it down, certainly under 12 inches from the strings, and keep it over the strings that are actually getting hit with the hammer. So there you go. Microphone recommendations. Generally speaking, it's good to use the same kind of microphone on the bottom and the top. But I will tell you that years ago, I discovered a little trick all on my own one day, in one of those experimental days I had. There was a microphone back in the day called a Sony, I believe it's called an ECM 50, and it was a lavalier mic that was probably the most popular, talking head clip-on lavalier mic for TV shows. the thing had no bottom end on it because they didn't want it to pick up rustling around or get a lot of proximity effect from getting close to the speaker's face or the sound source. So they rolled off the bottom end. It wasn't necessary, and they boosted the upper mids and the top end because they wanted to get the sound of the voice captured well. So one day I tried a Sony ECM50 on the top end of a piano, and it sounded amazingly good. And I think that I used it in combination with an AKG 414 on the bottom end. So there you go. If you happen to have a lavalier of any kind, generally speaking, they've got a pretty severe roll-off on the bottom end, and they make a pretty good sounding mic for the top end of a grand piano. I'm sure it would work great to drop it. They're Omni, by the way, which means they pick up all around. So if I were recording an upright piano, I might dangle one just down into the upright part of the piano. And do you really need to record a grand or an upright in stereo all the time? Not really. I mean, frankly, a lot of times I would end up with two piano tracks that were recorded in stereo, and I might end up panning them to 1 o'clock and 9 o'clock. Keep them both on the right side because maybe I had a counterpart that was done by an electric guitar and acoustic guitar on the other side. So I didn't necessarily want the piano to be split wide. Plus, when you split it wide, if you do have a guy who plays with a fairly heavy left hand, the energy coming off the bottom end of the piano is going to peg your meters a lot and affect your mix balance. And a lot of that low-end energy isn't really necessary. It doesn't add anything to the recording. If anything, it just kind of muddies up where some of the guitars would sit. So there you go. You can solve that problem by rolling off some low mids or some bottom end that's unnecessary. You could throw a compressor on it, but then if you've got the bottom end compressed to avoid the big wonky sound you might get with the heavy left hand, and you don't have the right hand or the higher end mic compressed, could be asking for phase problems. So there you go. So is that good on the piano, you guys? Any questions? I'm going to look at the chat for a minute. Actually, I need to widen this out so I can read it a little better. Mountain Man says, move on. Why did I leave the studio? Because my first daughter was born and I got tired of never seeing the kid. If you're going to have a baby, be nice to know your kid. So when she was probably about a year old, it just made me, I was tired of hearing about it from my ex-wife that I was never home. Bad enough that I wasn't seeing much of her. Even worse, I wasn't seeing my daughter. And I was tired of working with people who were wired on blow and wanted to work until 5 o'clock in the morning all the time. So there you go. Piano brand, I don't know. Yamahas are consistently really good sounding. Everybody should have a Bosendorfer. I don't know anybody who can personally afford one. Steinways are great. I've heard a couple of bad Steinways, but for the most part they're great. But for affordable, in quotes, baby grands and grand pianos, I think Yamahas deliver a lot of bang for the buck. Okay, you guys want to talk about vocals? I see people talking about vocals. All right. So, vocals. Again, you know what? Consider the source. You're not going to use the same microphone for a female as you would for a male. You're not going to use the same microphone for a guy who's singing a really edgy, really loud, screechy rock and roll track You're going to use a different mic for that than you would for a very delicate, intimate thing. I used to 414s, AKG 414s were one of my favorite microphones back in the day. Frankly, they rarely sounded good on a female because their voices are a little higher and a little thinner. Please don't send any letters about me being a sexist. I'm talking physics now and the human anatomy. So I would say that I tended to use 87s, Neumann U87s. Couple times I had great success with tube 47s, and a couple of times I got my hands on a Neumann tube 67, which is one of the most magnificent sounding microphones on the planet. Listen to all the Linda Ronstadt stuff that Val Garay engineered. He used a 67 that he still has to this day that, for my money, is one of the best sounding, that particular mic on her vocal. Just sounded stupendous. Of course, I would imagine you could probably put a lavalier on Linda Ronstadt and it would sound pretty darn good. So, let's talk about male vocals and then move on to female vocals. I think most engineers have a go-to mic. Now, it may be that a Neumann U87 is your go-to mic, but most guys who have more than one, maybe have several, work in a pro studio and have, an amazing mic collection, more often than not will find one microphone that sounds 20 or 30% better than the rest, even though they're all the same model and might even be out of a similar batch and vintage. I would tag those microphones. I would take a Sharpie and somewhere down around the connector, put a little black dot on there, put my initial on it, to know that was the killer sounding microphone. So that was generally my starting point microphone. Sometimes I would use a 414 if it were a really breathy, close vocal. I would use a 414, but they were pretty bright and you had to watch out for sibilance. If I could avoid EQing and wanted, sometimes you want mouth noise and you want to hear the air literally going over the vocal cords. So you want to take a microphone that's a big capsule condenser and throw it this close to the victim and put a nylon stocking pop filter in there so you don't get any pops. And you want that really warm, intimate, up-close sound so that in the mix it sounds like it's dead center and this close to your face when you're listening. Got to tell you, there were plenty of times that I used a 57 to record a rock vocal. There were times where I would do rock records and, you get a vocalist standing there singing into an 87 in a darkened room with this microphone on a giant boom stand and a pop filter in front of it and 6 or 8 people in the control room all looking at the guy. You would never get the vocal performance. So here we go, back to Neil Young saying, don't worry about the engineering, worry about the performance. Sometimes I would just take a 57 or a 58 and give it to the singer and say, go crazy, handhold that sucker and sing the vocal like that. Because you know what? The chances of hearing the sound of that microphone being held in the hand in the final mix, not that great. In solo, are you going to hear it? Yeah, but you know what? You hear all kinds of crap in solo that you'd never hear in a mix. So use a mic that makes the singer feel comfortable. If the singer is used to using a handhold on stage, let him go crazy out in the studio with a handheld. SM7, amazing for rock vocals. I would agree with that. I've been around so long, I remember when the SM7 first came on the market. Let's see. So, anyway, yes, a Neumann TLM 103 is pretty darn good. It is, but how many people have one of those at home? I don't know. See, I don't know what you guys have at home, and a lot of what I'm trying to convey today is kind of aimed at people that don't have a lot of gear. Those are the people that I want to help the most. People who don't have $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 worth of gear, but still want to record. And maybe, GarageBand does some pretty amazing stuff. So let me tell you something right now. Shirelli's microphone, the Gauge ECM 87. people, I think he discounts them at the road rally, if I'm not mistaken, to $99. And yes, he is my best friend, but no, I don't get a kickback. And I'm not telling you this so you run out and buy a bunch of his microphones because he is my best friend. Hopefully you know me better than that. But I got to tell you, I was one of a half a dozen so-called golden ear people that did a blind taste test on the ECM 87 before Shirelli started selling them, and tested it against like 2 or 3 kinds of Neumanns, an AKG 414, maybe an Audio-Technica mic, roughly half a dozen, maybe 6 or 8 or 9 other microphones, and didn't know what we were listening to. And we all did it individually so we wouldn't influence each other. And sat there for hours, and Shirelli would just do an A-B with like keys jingling, or somebody speaking into the microphone, or somebody singing into the microphone, or a snare drum on the microphone, an acoustic guitar on the microphone, and you'd go A, B, A, B. Sit there. It was kind of painful, actually. But if I remember correctly, on average, 94% of the time, those of us who were involved in that testing picked that $150 Chinese mic, which is now, has been for years, the Gauge ECM 87. They've done a few improvements over the years, probably changing out some capacitors and stuff. I think it's now called the Stealth because it's black with maybe a chrome screen on it. But it all started when Shirelli was working with some vocalist, could have been Madonna, I don't know. Somebody brought one of those mics with him to a session and insisted that Rob use that mic. And he's like, hey, I'm the engineer here. And they said, nope, if you want to record me, you're going to use this microphone. And, it looks like an 87, like a Neumann 87. And as soon as he heard it, he flipped out and said, what is that? And it was some just, nondescript brand. It wasn't called a Gauge back then. They're Chinese factories that, make the same microphone, sell it under 6 different labels to whoever wants to buy a quantity of them. So Shirelli cut a deal because when he imported his first, 10 or 20 or 50 of them, he noticed that several of them sounded really bad and some of them sounded amazing. So he cut a deal with the factory that he would pay more for the wholesale price, and but had the privilege to ear check every microphone and send any microphones back that didn't meet his standard. So that's the cool thing about Gauge. Anytime you buy a microphone, you know that either Shirelli or Chandler Bridges, his partner, who's also got gold and platinum credits, have actually listened to the microphone and said, that's a good one, and sent the bad ones back. So anyway, I got to tell you, I think some weeks ago I played that song Suicide that my daughter Hannah did, and we were going over to the Shirelli's house for a barbecue or something, and Rob said, oh, just bring her over here, I'll record her real quick, because we just wanted to get a quick guitar vocal down for copyright purposes. And if I remember correctly, he used a Gauge ECM 87 on Hannah. He did shove it through a tube compressor, I believe. And she just did one pass. That was it, one pass, and it sounded amazing. And to this day, every time I play that demo for people, they go, wow, her voice sounds amazing. Yeah, of course, my kid's got an amazing voice, but the microphone sounded amazing. So there you go. Also, I want to give a shout out to the people at Apogee. They manufacture this thing that's about... Sorry, got to give a little visual aid here. They make a thing called the One. It's about that big, about the size of my phone, and I think it's about, I don't know, $300 maybe. And it's a really sweet sounding Apogee digital to analog converter, or analog digital converter, and it's got a microphone built into it that was tuned by what's his name? One of the greatest living engineers. Come on, somebody help me with this. Bob Clearmountain. Thank you, Peter Guitar. Yes, Bob Clearmountain is actually married to the woman who owns Apogee, and obviously he's very involved in the company, so he tuned that microphone. I got to tell you, for, I don't know, $250, $300, whatever it costs, I use it at home on Hannah. The thing sounds amazing. It's a great vocal mic. It's a great guitar mic. I know people that have done entire records using nothing but an Apogee 1 and a Mac laptop, and literally have recorded whole songs or maybe even full albums using nothing more than that combination. The cool thing about it is you don't need an external power supply. It plugs in with the USB, and it's got the converter built in, doesn't need a preamp, and it sounds amazing. Literally, it sounds like $1,000 or $2,000 microphone, and I think there's probably very little that you couldn't use it on. Not sure if I'd want to stick it in front of a guitar amp, like a Marshall stack right up against the grill cloth. Don't think I'd want to put one right next to a snare drum and take a chance on getting it hit, but sounds amazing. I think it'd be incredible on a piano, definitely on acoustic guitar, and sounds amazing on a vocal. Have any of you guys ever used one? Peter Guitar says yes. I've got the Duet, which I think is the 2-channel version of it, right? Can't beat it for remote. Yep, I love it. So, you know what? If I had, like $1,000 to spend on home studio gear, and let's assume that I've already got a laptop and I've already got GarageBand, which I think is pretty darn good for, I could get broadcast quality stuff out of GarageBand. It's because I'm so amazing? No. It's because the quality of what GarageBand does is far better than what used to exist in real studios back in my dinosaur days. So if you take GarageBand and you've got the Mac laptop, let's say that for $1,000, what would I buy? I would buy a pair of 57s. What does a 57 cost these days? $100, somewhere around there. $99 new. Okay, so I'd buy a couple of 57s, and I would buy an Apogee 1, and I would buy, so what are we up to so far? Like $450. Buy a pair of ECM 87s from Gauge, so that's another $300. So now we're up to $750. Maybe the ECM 84, which approximates the Neumann KM84, KM184, I think it's now called, which is a small capsule condenser, which I find they work really well on piano, acoustic guitar, and on certain types of electric guitar stuff. Yeah, it's the pencil mic. It's, I don't know, I'm looking for something. It's about roughly that big. Wouldn't say it's as skinny as a pencil, but it's like 3/4 of an inch across and maybe 3 or 4 inches long. Doesn't sound as good on as many things maybe as the ECM 87, but there are some things that it sounds spectacular on, and I believe they're pretty inexpensive. So there you go. You could have that complement of microphones. So you'd have two 57s, two of the 87s, the Apogee 1, and a couple other mics. So there you go, 7 microphones. You could almost do like a live band with that. And there you go. What am I using now? For what? I barely record anything. I've never used a Rode NT1A, but I understand that it's a great mic. I mean, there's so much that I haven't used. I'm not sitting behind consoles anymore. Really, the only recording I do now is the occasional thing with Hannah at home. Most of the time, she won't work with me. She's too good for me now. Okay, let's get back to vocals. Dear God, time is flying. Okay, so vocals. Female vocals. You know what? If you're going for a master take and it's a really delicate thing, I there are rare occasions I would recommend, you know what, go rent a Tube 47. But nobody's going to know the difference. You know, for $150, which is probably what you'd spend to rent one for a day, you can just buy a Gauge ECM 87 for $250. You can go out and buy the Apogee one, and it's going to sound great. So there you go. Again, things like the dynamic of the vocal, the octave that it's in, the natural sound, of course, of the singer's voice. If you have a female with a really high voice who's singing in a high octave, you're not going to want to use a mic that's got a lot of top end on it, like a 414. Use something that's got a little bit more harmonic distortion going on, you know, in the mids to lower mids that might add a little beef to an otherwise skinny voice. So there you go. Bluebirds, love practically everything those guys build. Got to tell you, the single best vocal mic that I ever personally used, and I don't even know the number, but it's called a Neumann Hitler bottle, and it looks a lot like the Bluebird. You know, it's got kind of a big old body on it, and then a little skinny pencil neck thing, you know, literally like this big, and then there's like a little satellite capsule thing that sits on top of it. It's called a Hitler bottle. I don't know what to tell you other than I used one. The last time I did anything in a real studio for a label was around 1996. I think the artist's name was Ira Marlowe, maybe. And I remember they had a Hitler bottle at the studio, and the assistant engineer said, "You got to try it." And I tried it, and it sounded amazing. It sounded significantly better than any other microphone I'd ever used. Unfortunately, the artist didn't want me to use it because he wanted the ability to go home and possibly punch in on vocals at home and didn't want to have to rent that microphone and take it back to San Francisco. So there you go. But somebody says I prefer the Malcolm X version. Yeah, there are a lot of good Hitler bottle jokes. I won't go there. Anyway, they sound great. Okay, so that's vocals and microphones, but let's talk about compression and EQ. Always try the vocal flat. See how the microphone sounds on the vocalist. If you're having to EQ a lot, you know, like adding a ton of top end to a vocalist, you probably picked the wrong mic. If you have to add a lot of bottom end to a vocalist, you probably picked the wrong mic. So picking the right mic, I mean, you know, really, you might add a couple of dB on the bottom or a couple dB on top. You might want to roll out a couple of dB in the lower mids if they sound a little muddy. For the most part, a great microphone, the right microphone on the right vocalist, should allow you to work with very little EQ on the record side, probably on the mix side as well. As far as limiter compressor, again, so much is determined by the vocalist, the octave they're singing in, the dynamic of what they're doing, and the context of where you can imagine that vocal fitting in the song. I would sometimes adjust what I was doing on the record side, being able to envision where I wanted the vocal to sit on the mix side. Why not get it right going to tape? So there you go. Moving on. Dear God, I can't believe how much time has passed. Okay, acoustic guitar. Years ago, back when I was a kid, I was in the studio, and Tom Dowd, who I think is one of the great engineers of all time, said to me, "Do you want to know how to get a great acoustic guitar sound?" And I said, "Why, of course I do." I'd be an idiot not to take his advice. He was the guy that produced Layla and Aretha Franklin and just a million other amazing records during his career. He said, "Do you want to know how to get a great acoustic guitar sound?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "All right then, get down on your knees." And I looked at him and went, "What?" And he said, "Not for that, you idiot." And he said, "Get down on your knees. If you don't have worn out knees on your jeans, then you're not working hard enough as an engineer." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Get down on your knees and move your head around and listen to the guitar." I said, "Okay." And he picked up a guitar. He wasn't an accomplished guitarist, but he just picked up a guitar and played a couple of open chords. He said, "Now move your ear around." I moved my ear around. He said, "Stop when it sounds good." And I stopped, and he said, there you go. You want to get a great acoustic guitar sound? Move your ear around that way, because you're going to hear what the guitar player is playing. Again, it's about their touch, the dynamics, the octave they're playing in, the part of the room they're sitting in, how new the strings are, how old the strings are, what gauge the strings are, what kind of guitar it is. All that stuff goes into the formula. So while you may have a typical acoustic guitar setup, a typical acoustic guitar microphone, the one thing I can tell you with great certainty is get down on your knees and move your ear around, and whenever it sounds good to your ear, stick a microphone there. Again, a Neumann 87, a Gauge 87, KM 184, a Gauge, ECM 184, there literally are dozens of microphones that I think would give you a great sound on an acoustic guitar. Depends what you're going for. You know, if you're going for John Mellencamp, he tends to use fairly large-bodied acoustic guitars, I think mostly Gibsons, if I remember correctly. And I think he uses a fairly heavy gauge string, and he tends to play pretty hard. That's going to require a different mic technique and a different compression setup, different EQ, all kinds of stuff. But start out with what you think is going to work, and then move your ear around and go, oh, sounds good there. Put the microphone there and start there. If you're going for a very eagly, very silky, kind of strummy acoustic guitar part, I loved 414s on those. 414s with a fair amount of compression on them, although I'm not a big compressor guy. I didn't compress the piss out of a lot of stuff. But again, depends on the octave, depends on the dynamic of the player, and depends on the strings. One thing I've noticed in current sounding contemporary, we all love that word, contemporary music, I hear a lot of stuff now that actually sounds like people are using heavier gauge strings, and that the strings aren't that new. You can kind of hear when the strings aren't that new, and there's a sound. I'm trying to think of an artist I can use an example, but I can't really quickly. But I hear that sound a lot, and it's definitely not the silky, strummy, lighter gauge, eagly sound. It's thicker gauge strings, probably strings that aren't put on the day before the session or the morning of the session. And they don't have as much top end, but they are more robust in like the lower mids in a good way. By the way, lower mids can often be, and I'm talking about frequencies now. When I say lower mids, man, I haven't even talked about equalizers yet. But lower mids, like 400 hertz, 700 hertz. Basically, think of an equalizer as like the tone control on your stereo. And everything that's like 4,000 hertz up to maybe 12,000 hertz, think of that as your treble control. Everything from 4,000 hertz down to, which is the same as 4K or 4 kilohertz, everything from there down to maybe just below 1,000 hertz, like 700 hertz. That is the mid-range. And then you have lower mid-range, which is like 250 to 700 hertz. That's the muddy stuff that sounds like this and is usually crap that you can roll out and take away. It makes a lot of instruments suck, and that is part of the magic of EQ, is rolling out the lower mids, although if you overdo it and do it on every instrument, then your mix overall will sound like you sucked out all the lower mids. So on acoustic guitars, sometimes you want the lower mids to go away if you want the silkier sound, but I find that I'm hearing more and more guitars today that sound like they have thicker gauge strings and probably older strings, and they are not sucking out those lower mids. They're leaving them in. And you know what? In the context of the type of music they're doing, that I believe is a good recording technique, because it makes the guitar kind of punch through, because so many other instruments have probably had the lower mids taken out. So there you go. trying to take a quick glance. No, we haven't done live electric guitar cabinets yet. But yeah, let's talk about electric guitars because I see a couple people asking about it. Oh, you know what? Remind me to go back to that. I want to talk about EQ. Look, so many people, myself included in the early days, are kind of intimidated and have a curious lack of understanding about what EQ is. It's the spectrum of frequencies. Just like light is made up of all the frequencies. White light is made up of everything that, all the colors of the rainbow. Smash them together and you get white light. Sound waves, same thing. I'm trying to think of a good analogy here, but obviously white noise is a mixture of a wide range of frequencies. But the single best way to get over your fear of EQ and can I screw something up with it? How do I use it? There is nothing better you can do than sit down and take a song, just record an acoustic guitar and sit there and make sure you put the EQ button in on the console or on your computer. If you're on a console and it's got knobs, just push the button in, because I remember when I first started, I kept turning the knobs going, I don't hear anything. It's because I wasn't smart enough to push the button in. So once you put it in, then the equalizer becomes active. It's part of the signal chain, and it is basically a glorified tone control that does low frequency, low mids, and high frequencies, kind of divvies it up into what they call 4 bands. Okay? So the best thing to do is take each one of those knobs and turn up what's called the gain, where it says like +2, +4, +3, +6, whatever, increments it goes up in. Turn it up to like +6 or +8 or +10, something fairly drastic, and then take the frequency selector knob, and while the guitar is playing, just turn it, and you'll hear it go from sounding one way to sounding another way to sounding another way, and you go, oh, well, if I'm, centered on, if I'm boosting the lower mids at, let's say, 6 decibels, and I'm sweeping that knob from like 250 hertz to 400 hertz to 750 to 1,000, you'll hear a dramatic change. Well, by doing that, it's like understanding the tone control in your stereo. There really isn't anything that should be intimidating about it. It's just understanding that when you boost some frequencies, you'll go, wow, that sounds really good. And when you boost other frequencies, you'll say, wow, that sounds like crap. The same thing is true in reverse. Take the knob that is, like +2, +4, and turn it down to like -6, and repeat the same thing with the frequency knob, and just try it at different frequencies. And I'll bet you dollars to donuts when you get to those kind of low mid frequencies, 400 hertz, 700 hertz, that on a lot of stuff you're going to go, wow, that sounds a little better without that. But the thing about EQ is if you use too much of it going either direction, either in an additive way or a subtractive way, you're probably going to make the instrument sound unnatural, which sometimes you want. Most of the time you don't. So it's kind of like lighting in photography. If you add really bright, harsh white light to something, you're going to get a very stark, strident, edgy lack of subtlety on the subject's face, assuming you're doing a portrait. Whereas if you use a softer light and less wattage, and maybe from a distance, or maybe through the use of a diffuser or reflected light or natural light, you're going to get a softer look that's going to give maybe some subtlety and nuance. So for my money, most of the time you want nuance with equalization. There are times, of course, that you want to go for something rather intense. So feel free to crank it up. You go through stages as an engineer. I remember this very distinctly in my career, that I started out just being very happy to get a signal to go from a source out in the studio into a microphone, through the wire, into the plug in the wall, into the console and onto the tape machine. So the meter moved and I could hear it in the speakers. I'd go, wow, check that out. You go through that phase where it's mostly just learning about signal flow and being happy that you've got signal going from point A to point Z. But over time, you go through what I call the imitative stage, which is you're mimicking sounds that you hear on other people's records. It's kind of like songwriting. You know how I say that songwriters tend to write stuff that sounds like the period in which they first fell in love with music. So for me, that would be, 60s and the 70s. If I were a songwriter, most of my stuff would sound that way, unless I forced myself to listen to contemporary music and understand what makes it sound contemporary. Well, the same thing is true with engineering. After you just learn the basics of using the gear, then you go through this imitative stage, and you'll be very happy that you could get an acoustic guitar sound that sounds like the Eagles, or that sounds like John Mellencamp, or Jack Johnson, or James Taylor, and you tend to do a lot of imitating, but that's okay, as long as you're kind of mixing and matching what you imitate. You may want to use Steve Gadd kick drum sound from whatever record combined with Will Lee bass sound from another record, and then the James Taylor acoustic sound. It's okay to be imitative. It's good to have heroes, and it's good to identify what are the best sounds out there and then imitate those. But at some point, you become so good at what you do because you've spent those 10,000 hours doing the stuff over and over every day and always experimenting a little bit in increments, by the way. Incremental experimentation is good, especially when you've got a client that's paying you money. Don't do anything too wacky. You're wasting their time and their money, and it's not all that cool to spend 4 hours trying to get a wacky guitar sound when somebody's paying you by the hour for that. Go with what you know. But yeah, you might want to push it by 10 or 15% by trying a little more compression than you normally would. But you can do that in a minute or two. So there you go. Cutting 300 hertz on a kick, yay. Boosting 1 to 3K for attack, absolutely. Those are the magic numbers. I'm probably not even going to get into drums today because I could do a whole hour on that. All right, so we've done acoustic guitar. Have we done acoustic guitar? Yeah, we did. By the way, stereo miking, I think I've mentioned this on the show before. It's extremely rare that I would ever stereo mic an acoustic guitar, especially for like a pop record kind of thing. Yeah, if I were, recording a classic flamenco guitarist, maybe I would stereo mic that guy or gal. But for the most part, for pop records, especially if it's strummy stuff, why bother? You're just asking for trouble. Electric guitar. I can't ever remember a situation where I didn't try a Shure 57 pretty much up against the grill cloth on any guitar sound, and whether it was a Fender or a Gibson, whether it was a solo or power chords, whether it was a Marshall Stack or a Fender Twin. For some reason, 57s sound great on almost every electric guitar. Now, that's a great fallback position. You can always stick a 57 right up against the grill cloth, and depending on the kind of part, depending on the octave, depending on the room you're in, depending on the dynamic of the player, depending on a lot of stuff, which pickup is he or she on, all those things go into the mix. Go into the recording. And over time, just by being in the room and trying different things, you'll learn kind of where to start. And then you add a little salt and pepper to taste. But 57s just work. They work great. I went through a phase where I tried RE20s because I saw somebody use one. I thought, oh, that makes sense. They handle a lot of level. Didn't sound that good. I would use, there was a Sony mic. I want to say a Sony 377. I think it was its predecessor might have been a Sony ECM 37P, if I remember correctly. Anyway, those are probably like late 60s, early 70s mics that you could pick up for not a lot of money right now. They sounded great. If you listen to the first Firefall album, showing you how old I am, how far I go back, there's a guitar solo on the song You Are the Woman. And if I remember correctly, that was a Strat through a Fender Twin and recorded with the Sony, it's either 337 or 377. And through an 1176 limiter, and that was a great sound. So those mics work really well. Very often, if I'm recording, especially on a day where I'm doing overdubs, doing a lot of guitar overdubs on a lot of different songs on the same record, I would set up like 4 or 5 or 6 different microphones and different combinations of EQ and limiters or compressors, and have everything ready to go so that I didn't have to do a different setup every time the guitar player went from doing chinks, just overdubbing chink, chink, chink with a Strat, to maybe doing power chords with a Les Paul through a stack of Marshalls. I would usually set up, let's say the guy had 2 amps. Put a 57 on the grill of both amps, take an 87 and probably kick in the pad, which is basically just something that knocks down the input to the microphone by 10 dB. It's not a physical pad, but I would pad the mics down 10 dBs and probably have those back somewhere between 12 inches and 3 feet from the amp, kind of angled like that, especially if it was sitting like on a chair on a wood floor, or the amp was sitting directly on a wood floor, maybe angling it down a little bit so you get some of the reflection and the liveness and the brightness of the wood floor. I would probably take something like a 414 or an 87 and throw it in Omni, meaning that it picks up all the way around, and put that somewhere between 6 and 10 feet back. And if I were in a particularly good mood, I would probably have a couple of room mics set, 30 feet away up in corners of the room. And that way you can have all those things on their own fader. And depending what kind of part the guitar player is playing, depending on what kind of guitar he or she is using, depending on the amp, depending on the octave, all those little dynamic variables that change all the time, I would just tell the guitar player, run it down with the track one time, and then bring up first fader. Not bad. Second fader, not bad, a little better. Third fader, nope, too roomy. Fourth fader, way too roomy. Let's go back to fader number 2, which is the 87 at 3 feet. Okay, so I bring that up about 2/3 of the way, and then maybe add in a little bit of the 57 up on the grill to get a little bit more edge on it, and go, wow, that combination sounds pretty good. Then kick in a compressor and maybe add a little bit of, 100 hertz to it to fatten up the bottom or something. And there you go. Would have a guitar sound. So does that make sense? Do you guys do stuff like that already? Yeah, ribbon mics work great, but man, they crap out so easily with that kind of level. Although the ribbon mics I used were twice as old as I was, so maybe the newer ribbon mics made by Bayer work better. But yeah, using like old RCA ribbon mics back in the day, those things were extremely humidity sensitive, very level sensitive. I saw somebody mention mixing, and I want to tell you guys something. Everybody, get your pens and pencils out. I'm going to move my chat window over. Okay. This book, FET's Mixing Roadmap by FET. FET teaches at the Road Rally every year. Doesn't have a last name. At least nobody's allowed to know what it is. Just goes by FET. He's a dear, dear friend of mine. I want you to know I make no kickback from recommending this book. I'm not doing it because he's a friend of mine, but he sent me a copy of this book, which I didn't realize. He wrote before the Road Rally and brought it and sold a bunch of them at the Road Rally. He just showed up the other day in a padded envelope with a little note saying, hey, thanks for inspiring me in some way to write this book. And I thought, oh, that's sweet. And I took it home and I read the book cover to cover on Saturday. It's not all that thick. It is 113 pages. I got to tell you, I've read a lot of books on recording and mixing. This is by far my favorite book on the subject of all time. Absolutely amazing. It is called Fett's Mixing Roadmap. I told Aaron to put the link up there so you guys could find it. It's for everybody. I would say novices all need to read it. Pros will find stuff in there that they go, didn't think of that. This book makes it so easy, and it's got color diagrams. It's not actually the most colorful diagram in the whole book, but it's got color screenshots, and it's just written. You know what this book is? This book is like what Robin Frederick's books are on songwriting. You know how it sounds like she's talking directly to you and it's a good friend giving you advice? This book is written exactly like that. It's in plain English. It is for people who think they're tech phobic but would really like to learn the basics of recording so that they could mix their own stuff in Pro Tools or Logic or GarageBand. You've got to buy this book. It's not cheap because it's got color stuff on every page, which makes it really expensive to print. But you know what? It's $35 or $39, and I actually went on Amazon today and gave it a 5-star quickie review. I endorse it. Tell you what, you buy this book and don't find it to be as good as I'm telling you, I will reimburse you the $39.95, even though I'm not selling you the book. I believe that strongly that it is the best book on mixing that I've read in 30-some years of giving a damn about stuff like that. So kudos to the chef. Fett, you did a great job on that book. Doubt that you're watching the show, but if you are, I love your book. Okay. $39.99. Okay. Yeah. Absolutely amazing. Okay, what have we not spoken about yet? Talked about microphones. Oh, I want to talk about gain. I hear this all the time. We get so many recordings in that sound like acoustic and electric guitars and pianos that all sound like it's just like pure treble, like all the bottom is rolled off. I have mentioned, I think before on the show, it sounds like somebody took a razor blade and strummed the acoustic guitar with a razor blade. It's like, wow, how did you get it to sound that bright, that trebly, that steely, that metallic sounding? I just don't know. But I know that a lot of people don't really understand gain, and gain means volume and level. You know how you get in your car and you turn the radio up and there's a sweet spot where stuff sounds good in your car for whatever reason. It's like the volume that you like it at combined with when you get it to a certain volume, your car stereo just sounds better. Well, the same thing is true on the input side of recording. So let's assume that like you've got a Mackie 12 input console or whatever, you know, a Mackie 8 bus, which I think was a great analog console. So this is one of those things like pushing in the EQ in button. I remember in the early days of turning up a mic pre and going, well, why do I really need that when I've got this fader that also controls the input? Well, guess what? They work together. It's kind of like the gears in your car and the gas pedal, the transmission and the gas pedal. They do work together. And electronics, in the context of audio, sound good when there's just the right amount of level or input or gain or volume. They're all kind of the same thing. So just as a good overall statement, please don't say, oh, I turned my gain up to 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock, whatever. I always found that no matter what console I was working on, that typically, now it doesn't apply to everything because like a snare drum is not going to require the same thing as a very delicate acoustic guitar part. Generally speaking, though, if you turn your mic preamp up to about somewhere between 11 and 1 o'clock, let's call it high noon, and then bring up your input fader to 0, which is also called unity gain. That means nothing subtracted, nothing added. It's just like neutral. So if you do that combination, you should be somewhere in the ballpark of what is driving the electronics of your console with enough level that it will sound good. Audio components sound good when they have a certain amount of level. Different brands, different components like resistors, capacitors, and what have you, transformers within the electronics all react differently. The great sounding consoles of all time, like the Needs or the APIs, have a really awesome sounding combination of those elements that when driven with the right amount of level or gain or input, get just this really sweet sounding harmonic distortion that actually adds to the musicality of instruments. And over time, when you spend enough time sitting behind consoles, you will get to learn that maybe overdriving your preamp a little bit on an electric guitar accentuates that harmonic distortion that makes power chords on a really sweet sounding guitar going through a tube amp sound really, really good. So try that. But I hear a lot of stuff where I think people don't even bother turning their preamp up at all. They leave it all the way down at the bottom, and then they crank their fader up, and they get to the top of the travel on the fader, meaning, if our fader is there, they shove the fader all the way up trying to get enough volume, and really what they're doing is just adding a bunch of noise that's in the circuitry of the fader. When if you work in combination of turning up the preamp to noon, then you only bring your fader up to about there, which would be 2/3 the way up and somewhere around 0. That combination will probably sound good. It will at least get you in the ballpark. So, yeah, the single biggest rookie mistake that I hear people making is really, really thin sounding acoustic and electric guitars, and I wonder, really, do these people, just roll off all the bottom end and turn the treble or the high end all the way up and then take all the lower mids out and then don't turn up the preamp at all but take the input fader and crank it all the way up? I can't even imagine how they make things sound like that, but we hear it all the time, and I kind of want to eliminate that in the world. You have to really work hardly, or work stupidly, for lack of a better way to say that, and I don't mean to be unkind, but to make stuff sound that thin and that awful, you've got to really screw something up. If all you did was put your preamp around 12 o'clock high and your input fader around 0 and took a cheapo microphone, a 57, and put that in front of an acoustic guitar, it's going to sound reasonably good. Maybe not like Bob Clearmountain did it, but it's going to sound way better than sounding like you took a razor blade and strummed your guitar with it. Okay. Yes, EQ is absolutely subjective. Look, everybody likes their stereo to sound different, but very few of us would use the tone controls on our stereo and make it sound like this, right? Although I've got to say, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a meeting at a record label or somewhere and they pop something in and it sounds like they just, whatever settings the knobs happen to be on in their stereo, the day they unbox it, they left it and it just sounds like this. It's like, dude, do you not realize that you can't hear a cymbal or the top end of the acoustic guitar anywhere in this record, and this is what you're judging stuff on? So I'm sure that's not true for every A&R person or every publisher out there, but I've heard a lot of it. All right. I also mentioned that I would talk about the secret to using a limiter or compressor. limiters and compressors are really the same thing. What it is a device that looks at the incoming level and says, if it's in the limiter mode, I'm going to limit the amount of level coming out of that and going, let's say, to the tape machine or the console. So let's say the guitar player is playing a really nice lead and then all of a sudden just wails on the guitar. Well, unless you want to sit there with your finger on the fader that is the input fader and ride those levels, which is really hard to do because you don't know when somebody's going to send you a zinger down that wire, then you put a limiter on it. And what the limiter does is immediately upon detecting a big spike in level, it puts a cap on it. And I don't mean a cap like a baseball hat. I mean, it's like a governor on an engine. It says, can't go any higher than that. So it protects you from overloading other circuits and creating distortion. Back in the days of tape, it would eliminate you, oversaturating the tape or maybe the channel on the tape machine. So that's what a limiter does. Now, the way you set up a limiter is by setting a thing called the threshold. And people, Fett and I were talking about this the other day when I called him to compliment him on the book, and he said, people always want to know what ratio do you use, Fett, on a limiter, because it's got like 2-to-1 ratio, 3-to-1 ratio, 5-to-1 ratio, and what the ratio means is that for every decibel that you're going over a predetermined point, it's going to reduce that volume by 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. So let's say I'm going to go 1 decibel hotter than where I want it to be, and I've got a 3-to-1 ratio. It's going to knock that signal down by 3 decibels. So that's limiting. Basically, think of it as just catching spikes and, for lack of any deeper explanation, avoiding distortion. It's a governor on your car. When you take that same device and use it like for an audio effect, if you will, that's compression. And how you do that is by setting it so it's always kicking in and always reducing the level. Now, to say, going back to the question that Fett gets asked all the time, what compression ratio do you use? Whatever you want. I mean, I would say people start in the safety range of 3-to-1. That's always a pretty safe place to be. But you know what? It has more to do with how much level is going into the limiter or into the compressor, and everything before it affects that. So the preamp affects how much level is going to it. The input fader affects how much level is going to it. They're one of the most famous limiter compressors of all time is the Universal Audio 1176, and it didn't have a threshold thing, a threshold knob, which a threshold knob says, I'm not going to affect this signal until it reaches a certain threshold. Instead, it only had an input knob, so the more input you gave the device, the more likely it was to reduce the amount of volume coming out the ass end of it. It's kind of like, I won't even go there. Anyway, so threshold is important. It's not so much the ratio as it is the threshold, because you could have a 12-to-1 ratio, but if you've got the threshold set really high, chances are very few notes are ever going to kick in that 12-to-1 ratio. It just doesn't matter, the 12-to-1 ratio of compression. So really, to be safe, until you really learn your way around a limiter and compressor, I would say just on average, again, turn up the input. If it's got an input knob, turn it up to somewhere around noon, assuming that you've got your preamp set around noon and you've got your input fader set around 0. Set the input somewhere between 10 o'clock and noon on your compressor. As far as the threshold goes, you know what? You just sit there and listen to what you're doing and turn the threshold knob until it gives a threshold that causes the compressor or limiter to reduce the amount of gain. You'll see the needle moving in reverse, okay, if you have it set up in gain reduction mode. So that's the best thing I can tell you. It's the kind of thing, spend an afternoon with one and get to know it. Pretty soon it'll sink in. It's like an equalizer and sweeping the frequencies. The more you can play with this stuff when you're not in the actual act of recording something, the better off you'll be, because when you're busy recording something, you may be inspired to get a part down in a big hurry. That is the wrong moment to start understanding and learning about limiting and compression. That's the wrong moment to start deciding what EQ you should use or what microphone you should use. So do those things in your off hours when you can just play with the gear. All right. Dear God, it's 5:25. I've been talking nonstop for an hour and 25 minutes. I'm going to do 5 minutes of questions, and then let's call it a day, and maybe we'll do another recording show later, because I still would like to talk about background vocals and percussion, recording bass, recording drums. So hit me with a couple of questions, and then we're out of here. Exciters. Wow. Oral exciters. Those were invented probably in the late 70s. The Aphex oral exciter was probably the first one on the market, and then I think BBB came out with stuff. Oral exciters are great. Basically, they use some sort of time delay combination of delay and harmonic distortion, and it makes things sound good. But it's the kind of thing that if you put it on everything, then everything sounds like that and nothing stands out. I don't want to do a whole other show on mixing, because I have done a couple of shows, several shows on mixing over the years. But an exciter is something to be used judiciously, number one, and I tended to use them only in cases of emergency. If I had a mix that I loved on a record, but for some reason the vocal just wasn't coming out of the mix enough, and if I tried bringing up the level, it just didn't sound right by bringing up the level. If I tried EQ, it still didn't sound right. Maybe then I would throw an exciter on it and use that very judiciously, just to give it that extra little 5 or 10% edge. You know, with almost anything in recording and in mixing, turn it up to the point where you can hear it beyond all shadow of a doubt, and then back it down to where you can't, and then toggle in between too much, too little, too much, too little, just about right. It's like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Okay, one more. Gotta widen my screen out here. Well, the stuff is going by too quickly. Everybody stop for a second. I want to read something. It's hard to read as it's going like that. Yes, there was a time when Aphex was definitely overused. Do I like putting the vocal mic upside down, angled slightly away from the singer? It depends. But I will tell you that you can avoid pops. Yes, I would say that oftentimes I would use a big boom and aim the mic like this, so it's aiming at the vocalist's mouth. But if the vocalist is projecting air out here, you're still getting the sound of the face and the mouth, but you're avoiding the pops. If you put the mic right here, you're going to get the pops. Okay, so yes, angled down a little bit does work, and it avoids pops. Summing and grouping tracks within a mix? Yeah, but that's a mixing question. Today's show is recording, but yes, absolutely, why not? Should you stick your ear in the vocalist's face? Depends. Did you shave your ears? Did you clean your ears? There are a lot of things to be considered before you do that. But I will tell you that, yeah, you know what? Go out in the studio and listen to the singer sing. Have your assistant, or just put just roll the song and walk out into the room. I can't stress that enough. Go out into the room and listen to the source. That will help you so much. Best to record flat? Absolutely not. I think that that's my opinion. I know a lot of people that argue with me. Once you become proficient at EQ and limiting and compression, you become confident in what you're doing. You don't need to record flat. I jazz guys and purists record flat. Oh yeah, I record flat. Whatever. The one thing I would do is to not overdo it. I wouldn't, at least not in the early stages, don't print a lot of EQ or compression to tape. You may live to regret it. So just add a little bit. If you can obviously hear it or it sounds like a little too much, it probably is. Back it down. You can always add a little bit more in the mix. But as I became better at what I did and got comfortable and knew my own limitations and was extremely confident in which sound I was choosing, I would print a lot of EQ or a lot of compression to tape because that's just the kind of guy I am. Can mic selection help with a nasal voice? Yeah, to some extent, but not as much as a neti pot or what's that? Vicks Vapor Rub. Look, I recorded a lot of stuff in the 70s. A lot of people had nasal problems back then, if you catch my drift. So I kept a little thing of Vicks Vapor Rub around. Really good to open up the sinuses. If you've got to rely on a microphone to solve that problem, it's probably a problem that can't be solved. What if you hit him in the nose with the mic? Keith LeBron loves Vicks. Stuff works great. What kind of pot? It's called a neti pot. I think it's spelled N-E-T-T-Y. A neti pot is basically a very cheap nasal irrigation system, and they give you like this mixture you put in there. Basically, it turns it into like salt water, but kind of weak salt water. And you take this little pot and you stick a side of it up your nose and you tilt your head back, and the water actually goes up into your sinuses and then comes out the other nostril. It ain't pretty, but it works. Run salt water through your nasal passage. There's also this stuff called Ocean. You can find it at any pharmacy. It's in a white bottle with a little orange cap on it. It's overpriced saline, and that works really well, but it's expensive. Okay, we're at 5:31. I went 6 minutes over. So there you go. Was this helpful, or did I talk too fast and try and cover too much ground? All right, good. So should I do another recording show next week? Like I said, we've got Judy Stakey coming, but would you guys like me to kind of finish this up and do background vocals, percussion, bass, and drums on another episode of Taxi TV? Okay, well then I shall do that. By the way, as I mentioned in my email the other day, I am now starting to do what we call taxi house parties, where if you can get 10 people to come to your house or a meeting room of any sorts anywhere, I will do like an hour to a 90-minute private meeting. I've been doing it with colleges. As a matter of fact, I'm doing one after I finish this up at 7 o'clock tonight. I'm doing one with the San Diego Songwriters Guild. I've been doing them at Berkeley. I don't know. I've done several of them at universities, and I'm going to start doing them in private homes. So if you guys have like 10 musicians and you guys can pick the subject, it could be a film and TV thing. It could be a combination of recording, mixing, film, and TV. What I don't want to do is turn it into, hey, this is how Taxi works. I got to say, I would much rather do this than get on planes and fly all over the place. I used to get on a plane if I knew I had 300 people in a room. But you know what? I'm happy to do 10 people at somebody's house. And if you get the 10 people to actually show up, I will kick in $50 for beer and soft drinks. And we'll do 90 minutes together. One of the people that inspired this idea, who doesn't even know that he inspired the idea, is a guy named Lance Gale, who's from my hometown of Ottawa, Illinois. And Lance is because it's a small town of 15,000 people, I think he's kind of at the musical hub. All musicians in town know him. He's an extremely good guy, an extremely cool guy. Writes and records great stuff. He got a commercial placement through Taxi. I think he gets a lot of deals through Taxi. I know he gets a lot of deals through Taxi. Anyway, I was thinking about him one day and thinking, it'd be really cool if he could get a bunch of people from my hometown that I no longer know because I haven't lived there in a long time, and get them together at his house for pizza and whatever, and that I would show up and do a live Skype session. So there you go. If anybody wants to do that, email houseparty@taxi.com, and we're going to start scheduling like one of those a week, and I will come to your house, and I think it'll be a lot of fun. So there you go. See you guys next week for another exciting episode of Taxi TV Live. See you later, guys.